Hello, my name is Nick Hopwood. Some of you may have seen some of my other videos on publishing and things like that. I'm working from home today, and I'm going to do a short video about giving feedback in academic writing, and particularly that could be peer-to-peer feedback within a university context, maybe if you're among students in a writing group, or it's also really thinking about how I think effective peer review happens, for example, in academic journal publishing or other things like that. I have some slides prepared. I'll speak a bit to those, and then I might kind of switch back to the video. One of the reasons I switch the slides is it makes the video a much smaller file size. You might be preparing for a workshop with me on publications or something like that, in which you might be giving feedback on somebody else's abstract within that time, in which case these would be the principles that I hope we would be able to kind of practice and respect in the workshop that we're going to do together. You might be watching this quite remotely, in which case I hope this is useful, and you might find it useful to talk with your writing group partners or colleagues about whether you agree with some of these principles or not. As always, I really invite discussion if there are things that you don't agree with. That's really interesting, and please comment on the YouTube or on my blog nickhop.wordpress.com or via Twitter with my handle @nhoputs. I should start off by saying that I've been really inspired and draw a lot from the work of Pat Thompson and Barbara Kamler, particularly in their thinking about brokering and kind of pedagogies for how peer review works. I'm not going to cite or quote them directly, but I do want to acknowledge that they've informed my thinking a lot on this. What I'm going to do now is bring up the slides. So here we go. This is really about effective peer review and giving feedback on academic writing. The first thing, and this is assuming that peer review might be happening again within a writing group, it's not necessarily for purposes of a journal publication if you're reviewing for a journal, but it may be. But this could be any situation in which you're asked to give feedback or to review a text for a friend, colleague, student, other things like that. The first thing I think to think about is what effect you want to have as a reviewer and what you want the author to feel and do when they read your feedback. Now, I've put some random pictures here that I've just kind of Googled. Often when we get feedback, either from supervisors, from colleagues, or particularly me when I get feedback from reviewers on journals, you can feel a number of things which are maybe not very productive. You might feel kind of angry that you don't feel the person has respected you or read something carefully. You might feel frustrated that you haven't been communicating your ideas well, or people haven't paid proper attention to what you're doing. You may feel demoralised. You may feel like the whole thing is a waste of time, or you may feel encouraged, supportive and motivated. And I really think my assumption is that we really want to have a positive effect on authors, perhaps no matter how bad their text is, or at least kind of likely to be imperfect. We really want to be encouraging authors. We want them to feel confident in paying attention to what we have to say, and we want them to feel encouraged to go and continue and improve their writing. So I think what we really want to achieve when we're providing feedback or reviewing text for journals is to make sure the author thinks that we've read her or his work with an open mind. And that's really important. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to abandon all our academic values, the theoretical or methodological leanings that we have, but that we have to be ready to entertain scholarship which might not follow the way that we would have done it ourselves. In which case you might want to come clean as a reviewer and say, I'm normally somebody, for example, who would do qualitative research, and therefore kind of I felt the need to justify the quantitative approach was not as strong as it might have been, given that you might be wanting to address a broad audience. So that sort of thing. You can show that you've taken an open mind on something and allowed your reading to be coloured by the extent to which the author argues and defends their position, rather than the extent to which they agree magically with your prior kind of stance on research. Secondly, I think we really want to make sure that the people receiving our feedback or our reviews take our suggestions into serious consideration. Otherwise, it's been a waste of our time. If they read our reviews and think, God, that guy's an asshole, he or she hasn't read what I'm doing, doesn't know what they're talking about, then it's been totally wasteful. So we really need to think that when we're writing reviews or giving feedback, we're creating an impression of ourselves in that text. And it's really important to think about what that impression is, because that will affect how the person that we're writing that feedback for responds. And we really want them to take our ideas into serious consideration. I think it's fruitless to think that our aim should be to get the person to do what we suggest or do what we would like. Reviewing or feedback is not about getting people to write the text that we would have written. The best we can hope for, I think, is that people give ideas some serious consideration. Thirdly, we really need people receiving our feedback or our reviews to feel that we've offered criticism where it was due. There's no point sending things for feedback or for review simply if you want to be stroked and told how wonderful you are. Obviously, the idea of feedback or review is that the text will change, and therefore we do want to feel that criticism is raised, but where it's due. Finally, we want the author to feel encouraged to keep going and improve their work, and not to give up and feel worthless. And this is something that Pat Thompson and Barbara Kamler have written about, is it's very easy for people receiving reviews or feedback to extend negative commentary from, okay, this text wasn't perfect, to, oh my gosh, my research was awful, to, actually, I'm a hopeless academic. And we'll come back to that, but it's really important to try and avoid that consequence. I'd just like to suggest a few things about a broader framing of peer review and feedback as pedagogy and not gatekeeping. Gatekeeping would say, is this good enough? Is this ready for review? Should this be published? Is this ready to be submitted for examination, or those sorts of things? Or how good is this on a scale of 1 to 10? And I don't think that's really what feedback in writing groups and in journal publication is really about. Now, obviously in journals, we have to ultimately come to a decision about whether something is ready for publication or not. But often, prior to that decision, we actually have a formative, or what I would call pedagogic process. What I mean by pedagogic is simply that it has the effect of helping somebody else learn. Review, in my mind, or feedback, is not really about what's wrong with this text. That's a rather kind of nitpicky approach to it, and is one that's unlikely to produce the kind of effects that we were talking about in the previous slide. I think, and this is again drawing inspiration from Barbara Kamler and Pat Thompson, a nice way to think about giving feedback and review is, what can I offer as a particular reader to help the author achieve her or his aims in this piece of writing? Now, that might be to say that I'm a qualitative expert and therefore I don't understand some of the statistics that you're offering, therefore you might want to acknowledge that. It may be to say, I think what you're trying to do here is this, and we'll come back and talk about mirroring shortly, and therefore I think you might achieve this better. Remembering that we're trying to avoid the position of, here's how I would have done your research, or here's how I would have written it, to here's how, as a particular kind of reader, as part of your potential audience, I think you would improve your text, improve the communication of your ideas. So here are some do's and don'ts. They reflect each other. The green at the top would be the do's, and the don'ts would be at the bottom. And I'm just going to run through them quickly, and then I'll come back and go through them in more detail. Firstly, it's to mirror what you think the author is saying, and I'll say more about that in relation to the next slide. Secondly, it's to be specific. Thirdly, to give reasons for your views. Fourthly, to use language with care, and I'll say more about that in a second. Fifthly, to be blatantly subjective. Now, lots of people think, oh no, when I give feedback or a review I should try and be objective, but in my view there is no objective review. It's always you reading it on a particular day with a particular background, with particular values and priorities and interests, and acknowledging that is really important. Acknowledging the fact that, in fact, what's going on when you're giving feedback or a review is an interaction effect between the text and yourself. I'd then suggest there should be balance between praise and critique, and I might suggest that could be in the form of what you call a shit sandwich. And I'm going to argue that you should level a critique at the text rather than the author. The lines in red are exactly the opposite of those things, and that will become more apparent when I go through each point in more detail shortly. But firstly, I want to say something about mirroring. What I mean by mirroring is that you write down what you think the author intended to communicate. So often in reviews that you get, you might say, this is a paper adopting a case study approach to explore this phenomenon. The main arguments are X, Y, and Z. Now that's really, really valuable to an author. Firstly, because it's neutral, or is expressed neutrally. So the first thing you're not reading as the original author is a whole heap of judgments. Secondly, it can confirm that the readers that are engaging with your text are getting the meaning that you want. Or it might help the author realise that, oh, well, in fact, I didn't think that was the key argument that I wanted to present, and yet this person has thought that that was what I was saying. So mirroring can be very affirming and boosting for somebody without there having to be a judgment. Equally, it can be very, very instructive about the kinds of arguments that are being made and the way that they're landing with the different audiences that they're being there. So mirroring is a really, really important thing, and I would say if you can do nothing else, just mirroring what you think somebody is trying to argue or achieve is really important. That also helps to frame the comments that you might add then, because the original author will know that, well, you're giving these comments in light of thinking that this paper was, or chapter, or whatever it is, was supposed to be doing X, Y, or Z, and it might help them respond a little bit more effectively in a more sophisticated way to your comments. So mirroring first. Always mirror. I would really encourage that. So now back to the other reasons. Secondly, I put be specific. Now this is something that I've come across in many contexts, including some of my research in child and family health services, about how effective praise works. So it's no good saying to somebody, oh, your introduction was great, or your literature review was great. That's rather too general. Okay, so what about the introduction was great? What about the literature review was great? Or if you say the literature review needs work, well, that's far too vague. Being very specific. I think the justification of the scope of what literature was included in your literature review could be more strongly argued. There's something that's very specific. So avoiding things that are general at the level of the whole text or whole sections and being specific. Linked to this is the third point about giving reasons. Now this can really, really make the review or the feedback you give much, much more informative for the author and much more helpful to them. If you say, and this is both relating to praise and kind of criticism, I thought this was excellent because blah, or I thought this needed more work because blah. And it might be because it failed to persuade me as a non-qualitative researcher, excuse me, of the importance of studies that draw on small samples. So that's a very different way of saying something like, oh, your study was no good because it draws on only a small sample and therefore can't be generalizable, to say, I thought your argument in the methodology could be stronger in order to convince readers such as myself who aren't used to studies with small samples. Then I'd say use language with care, and it's amazing how much language makes a difference to the response that people have when you're writing. You could, I would say here, you can soften it and say, I wonder if, maybe, particularly if you're suggesting things, if you make them sound like they're kind of necessary or imperative, it can feel like to the original author that what's happening is somebody else is writing their paper for them and kind of becoming a ghost author, and they've lost their kind of autonomy. Whereas you might say, I wonder if that might improve it, or I could speculate this, or maybe what you're trying to argue is this. So you're entertaining some doubt or some kind of flexibility in the kind of the meaning here, so that you're not necessarily saying, I know I've got this right and you're definitely wrong, or whatever it is. So being really careful with language. Avoiding unnecessary emphasis. One of the things I often do when I get reviews back from journals is I get a big black pen out and mark, kind of black out the unnecessary words. If you're raising a problem with somebody, there's no need to overemphasize it was really confusing or this and that. Just by saying it's confusing to you will probably be enough to get the author to pay attention to something. Now, I said before about being blatantly subjective. What I mean here is that you write from a position as if it is an interaction between the text and you, which is producing this feedback or this review, which is exactly what it is. If somebody else was reading it, the review would be different. Therefore, objective statements like the literature review needs work are not what I'm suggesting. Rather, I would say, as a reader not familiar with this topic, I felt that some of the concepts in the literature review could need better explanation. That's what I mean by being subjective. Making it clear by the way you write things that it's from the interaction between the text and you might want to say something about yourself in order to help the original author know how best to respond to what you're saying. Next to last, balancing praise and critique. I put here a shit sandwich. Now often we might start with something encouraging, then raise some criticism at the end and finish with something encouraging. I would say you start with the mirroring, and then you might balance some praise and critique, but always wanting to finish with some word of encouragement, whether that's, well, it seems like there is a lot to do here. What I'm offering are these suggestions in order to make this interesting paper much more accessible to a wider audience, which will ultimately increase its value to the research community. Finishing with something like that can have a massive difference to how authors feel. So, I hope I haven't waffled on for too long about peer review and abstract feedback in writing groups. I do think that all texts get much better through being reviewed by other people, whether that's getting feedback from peers or colleagues or the students, as well as trying to understand the journal process of peer review as one that obviously includes gatekeeping about is this good enough, is this right for this journal, but often at its best has a pedagogic effect, that through giving feedback texts get better and the authors get more confident and competent in their writing. And if that's to be the effect that we have, that the texts that get shared with others and put into the public domain or submitted for examination are not perfect but the best that we can do, and if the authors are going to feel that a peer review or getting feedback from other people is something that doesn't doubt them as a researcher, then that's really important. I realise there's one thing I might have neglected to say before, which was about levelling criticisms at the text and not at the person. And this is really important. So instead of saying you have not explained your methodology clearly enough, where it's directed at you the author, you have not done your job well enough, you could say instead that the text, that the methodology section doesn't quite justify all the sampling or the methodological decisions that were made. So what you're reviewing is a text. That's all you have in front of you when you're a reviewer or giving feedback for somebody. You do not have them there. You're not criticising them as a person or praising them as a person. It's the text that you've given to have a look at to provide feedback on a review, and it's the text that you should be writing about in your review. So you'll see that on one of the slides here, where I say level critique at the text, not the author. Don't direct your comments to the person, but direct them instead to the author. So, just to recap, we have to really think about the effects we want to have if we're providing feedback or doing a review on a text for somebody else in academic writing. I think those effects would be that people think that we've given some proper attention and time to their writing, that we're not a kind of a vindictive person who doesn't know what they're talking about, or somebody who wants to try and impress themselves on the paper and have it written the way they would do it. We want to make people feel encouraged that they've been given criticism, which is what they want, but where it's due, perhaps in an instructive way. We want people to feel that the criticisms be levelled at the text and not at them as people. And I would say mirror first, be specific, give reasons for your value judgments, be careful with your language, balance praise and critique, level your criticisms at the text and not the person, and that will make a very big difference to how people experience the review that you're able to give them. I hope you found this short video useful. As always, please feel free to put some comments and posts on YouTube or on my blog or Twitter. See you soon in the next video. Goodbye.